Welcome to the Student Ministry Podcast. My name is Steve Kullman, and I'm so glad that you're tuning in today because we have a great guest. His name is Geoff Kullman. He is the Associate Pastor at Open Door Church in Maple Ridge, British Columbia. That's in Canada, for those of you that are not so geographically literate like myself. That's just outside of Vancouver, and he is our first international guest, which we are so excited to have him on today. He has experience both in the nonprofit world and in the church ministry, and he also leads up a ministry to millennials, which we're really excited to talk about today. But before we jump into that, let's talk about our sponsors, because our sponsors make this happen. In addition to you, our listeners, our subscribers, these sponsors are awesome. So let's talk about them for a second. The first one is WorkCamp NE. If you are in the market looking for a ministry that is going to be able to take your students and partner with them and take them into a community and really love on the people there, look up WorkCamp NE. That's WorkCampNE.com, because that is where you're going to find a lot of information about WorkCamp NE and what they do, mostly in the New England area. But they're starting to branch out to some different areas. Check out their website to learn a lot more about ways that you can get your students plugged in on an amazing mission trip. It's been fantastic for our students over the last several years. We've been going, I think, for 9 years to WorkCamp NE, and it's been amazing for our students. So affordable, practical, and very much focused on the love of Jesus Christ and taking that to the community where we're serving. So look up WorkCampNE.com. And our other sponsor is a combination sponsor between the National Network of Youth Ministries and Reach Youth New England. And all these organizations, both these organizations are really focused on partnering with student ministers, youth workers, and connecting them together across the whole United States, and especially in New England. So if you are looking for other youth ministers to get connected with, you're like, you know what, I look around and I feel like I'm alone. Look up the National Network of Youth Ministers at youthworkers.net, and you can also look up reachyouthne.com as well, and check them out and get plugged in and get connected with other youth workers. All right, now on to our interview with Geoff Kullman. Like I said, he's associate pastor at Open Door Church in Maple Ridge, British Columbia. He also leads up Millennial Ministry, and we're going to talk to him. So let's jump right in. Well, first of all, thanks so much, Geoff, for joining us today on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So for our listeners that have been tuning in for a while, they know that we kind of have this conversation based around three different questions. What's your story? What is God doing in your ministry right now? And then what are some tips of wisdom that you picked up along the way? So let's jump right in and let's figure out your story, Geoff. What's God been doing in your life to bring you to the point you are now?
Yeah, well, I guess the beginning of my journey, without going back to birth, I guess, would just be, coming out of, went to Bible college, felt called into ministry, the typical thing, going to Bible college, figure out what ministry is all about, what I need to learn in terms of figuring out the Bible and doing ministry. Graduated through that, and then actually went into the nonprofit world for about 6 years. So totally different from anything to do with ministry. It was managing people, managing volunteers, which is similar to ministry actually. But sure. So managing volunteers, managing product, managing fundraising stuff. So totally different from what I'd expected to do. And then about 3-4 years ago, my wife and I started to feel this nudge, this calling back into ministry. So I started looking around what was out there, and eventually ended up at my home church, the church where I grew up, where my parents still went, where my brother and his family all went. So eventually ended up doing ministry there for a number of years. And found that those lessons that I had learned in nonprofit management about building up strategy and empowering volunteers and training volunteers and getting to know in the nonprofit world, it was getting to know your customer or your client, but figuring out who these kids are, who these youth are, and what do they need most out of out of me and out of the volunteer team. So there was a lot more lessons of that we were able to transfer, a lot more than I thought. So I was at that church for just about 3 years until a month ago when I moved to a church that has 0 youth. So we're at the point now where I'd kind of built up the program at the old church, built it up from basically from scratch to a successful program, I guess you could say, to now moving on to this church where there's 0 kids.
Wow.
And figuring out what youth ministry and ministry in general looks like in a totally different context. So, wow. Yeah, that's my journey right now.
Wow, that's it's exciting. I'm sure. Like I know when I got to my current situation, almost 9 years ago, there were hardly any youth here as well, and it's been cool to see what God has done over the years. So I'm sure it's going to be exciting for you as well.
Yeah, and I guess people could get the wrong impression that it's a church full of gray hair. It's actually the opposite. It's full of young families and kids that are about to be youth, and a bunch of just aged out before I got here. So there's a lot of potential here, potential in the surrounding community, but. It's an exciting place to be right now.
Cool. So your ministry, what's it, you can talk about a little bit your previous church as well, but what's it kind of look like now? I know you're the associate minister there at the church, and I know you have another organization that you lead as well with Millennials. So what's all that look like? How does it all work together? Talk about your ministry.
Yeah, I guess mostly I'll talk about what we did at the previous church. Because those are the lessons that are most probably applicable right now. But coming in, it really was a total blank slate, the ministry that I came into. It had fallen apart from the days when I was a youth growing up there. It had been a place of a church of 300, but, we'd have 100 kids on a Wednesday night when I was growing up. So huge, massively successful, massively popular, really impactful youth ministry back in the day. And I came to a place that had 7 kids that might show up some weeks. So figuring out really what, like I said earlier, what those kids needed, what they wanted out of the ministry, and what their families and the church wanted this youth ministry to look like. So we really kept the program kind of going as it was while I set up some teams of, call them strategic leadership teams. So trying to figure out what was the history of this ministry, what were we currently doing well, and where do we want to see ourselves in 5 years. So we took a 6-month process, 6-month journey together of looking 20 years back in the ministry all the way through to where we want to be in 5 years, and what were the trends that we'd seen, and then what were the goals that we wanted to have moving out of that. So that really became the document that we set up at the end of those 6 months. Really was the guiding principles for everything we did in our ministry. So it was an intentional process of figuring out what do we want for our church kids, what do we want for our kids in the community. We also had a school attached, or the church has a school attached to the building. So what do we want for those alumni once they graduate out of, once they move on to high school? What connection do we want to still have with them? And then even globally, what impact do we want to have? So it really did guide everything that we did. So the theme, I guess, the ethos of that document was all about creating an environment that was really welcoming and really come as you are. And so we had some challenges in trying to mix our church kids that go to Christian school and are raised in amazingly supportive Christian homes, mixing them with kids from the high school across the street that were in foster care or came from really tough situations at home or just had no real foundation, no real solid foundation at home. So mixing those two groups together became a challenge, good challenge to have. But so that's where we took our ministry there, and also building up and training the volunteer team that we had was incredibly important, because they were used to working with church kids, and all of a sudden we had a core of church kids, but mostly kids coming from this high school right across the street. So training volunteers in especially letting them know you don't have to give the answer right away. Let's build trust through this dialogue and through discussion and conversation, and eventually we might have a chance to speak truth into the conversation. But especially with these high school kids from really tough situations, they just want a place where they can be heard more than where they can be talked at.
Right.
So that was the foundation of the ministry that we set up there, and so it moved from 7 kids and grew rapidly over the 3 years to be a place where kids really felt at home, especially kids from the community felt that our church building was a place of refuge, which was cool. Really satisfying, I guess, is a good word for it.
That's cool. How did the church kids, for the best word, or lack of a better term, how did they react to that transition? Because I've been at other churches where we've tried to make that transition, and some of them kind of tried to get, to leave, and they got kind of scared off, and their families are like, "Are you sure you want to bring in these other people?" And I'm like, "Yes, this is who we need to reach." But trying to mix those two were interesting. Yeah,
that's why we're here, right? That's why we exist is for those other kids. Yeah. For those people outside of our own walls. That's why we're at church. But it was really difficult. It wasn't so much difficult in the terms of that they didn't accept the kids. It was difficult in that they knew they had a different goal out of the midweek program, right? So the church kids wanted to dig into their faith, and they mostly are all from very strong Christian homes. They mostly all go to Christian school. They could teach the Bible study themselves. They want like next level deep stuff. And the community kids that were coming needed Jesus 101. So that was more the difficulty, was trying to change a cultural mindset in the church of, well, then you church kids have an opportunity to disciple these other kids, to be leaders of these other kids, to show them who Jesus is. Didn't always work out that way. So we actually, it was my biggest regret in my ministry there was that we set up a separate program for the church kids instead of teaching them how to integrate with the community kids. So then it kind of became an us and them type of situation, which wasn't the purpose. It's not the purpose of the kingdom of God to make an us versus them. It's there's just us.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I know a lot of youth ministers that have got to that point where we need something for those church kids so they can continue to grow, but we got to continue to reaching out to the community and reaching new students as well. And sometimes the logical choice is, hey, let's create a program for each group. But that's a regret for you, huh?
It is, and more because it created that divide. It wasn't that, it's not that I don't want to teach those church kids, deeper biblical truths. It's just that it created that division that never was able to be overcome. Yeah. So alternatively, I would have, preferred, well, let's have a once a month thing where anybody who wants to come and dig deep, spend all Sunday afternoon together, digging into a passage or digging into a theme or walking through the chronology of the Bible or whatever the case. That I would have much preferred that. But at the time when we set up that separate program for the church kids, I didn't know that would be what the outcome was. Right. Probably should have foreseen it, but I didn't. So, hindsight, right?
Yep. Oh, that's true. So you had walk us through your programming and everything. So you had the midweek program that was eventually designed mostly for newer students. When was the other program that you instituted?
So the midweek when I first came on board, there was just the midweek Wednesday program, which was meant to be a mix of whoever wanted to show up. So it was church kids and their friends, who were mostly all their church kids, and then a couple of high school kids that had a connection to the church. But then those high school kids that had a connection to the church started inviting their friends, The Wednesday night then became primarily community focused. It got identified as an outreach program. So then we had a Friday night program for the church kids, so to speak. And the interesting thing was that after about a year, on Friday nights, the kids from Wednesday who were starting to fall in love with Jesus would end up coming on Friday nights too. So then Friday nights became this mix still of church kids and community kids. And so sometimes the church kids stopped coming to Friday nights too. But the church kids still had Sunday morning. So so it was Wednesday night outreach, Friday night deeper Bible study, Sunday morning brief Bible study between our two services. Which was entirely, obviously, church kids.
Okay. All right, cool. And so I don't want to overlook your other ministry that you got to millennials. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So earlier this year, my wife and I really felt this passion and this nudge to start teaching pastors and churches about the millennial generation. And you look at churches across North America, right? And there's this gap of 20 to 35-year-olds that just aren't there. And that's always been a bit of an issue in churches. That's kind of always been an age that steps away. Generally, once they have kids, they start coming back. But millennials aren't coming back. So we feel very passionate and called into something a bit different of teaching pastors and in churches in general about the core values of who millennials are and why churches need to take note of those values and what defines this generation. Because without understanding them, you're never going to be able to communicate the gospel to them, and never going to be able to create a church environment that actually draws them in and keeps their focus there. So not necessarily about needing to change everything you do, but maybe tweaking some things that churches do to be more millennial friendly anyway. Yeah,
I went to some different workshops here and there to do that very same thing at our church and try to reach millennials better. And I realized a lot of it's just a different mindset change to think about them a lot more than you normally would, because they might come at things a different way, and you need to be able to put yourself as much as you can in the mind of a millennial so that you can begin to reach out to them.
Yeah. And recently I read a study that said, so churches might look and say, well, we have some millennials here. We have some young people that are still here. Some have left, but some are still here. The ones that tend to stick around actually have a mindset and a cultural understanding closer to their own grandparents than to their peers. So young people, millennials that stick in church, tend to think more like boomers than like millennials. So they're comfortable in the boomer-focused church because they actually see the world as a boomer sees it, which isn't a bad or a good thing.
Right.
It just is. But it's difficult to reach even their peers when they understand the world and look at the world in a totally different way.
Right.
Than their friends do. So
that makes sense. Because I think one of the things that we've tried to do is, we try to reach more millennials. Let's talk to millennials in our church. What do they like and what they don't like? Well, we think things are pretty good here. Well, that would make sense because, they're the ones that are connected already, and they're maybe thinking differently than your typical millennial.
Yeah, exactly. And when you think of a missionary who goes into to a country they don't know, into a culture they don't know, culture that's foreign from them, the first thing they do is try to understand that culture for weeks or months or years before they speak Jesus into that culture, right? They look for the places that the gospel is already there, and they try to figure out ways that they can communicate that effectively to that foreign culture.
Right.
Well, the millennial, the post-Christian culture we live in it's a foreign culture that we need to understand, that we need to take the time and invest the time into to understand so that we can speak the gospel effectively to a new generation that is a foreign culture to the Christian culture.
True. Great. So how do you guys do that? Does you have come into a church and work with them, or do you do workshops, or how's that all work?
Yeah, we do some workshops. So at conferences and things like that, we'll offer some workshops mostly around understanding, like a very basic level of who millennials are and why they think the way they do. There's actually very logical, rational reasons why millennials value something like diversity of opinion, and why they value something like community. There's just the way they've grown up is the way that they understand the world. So you can't blame them for understanding the world, because that's just the only version they know. Right. So going in teaching workshops like that. There's also some consulting work that we do with churches, where we can take a church through a whole weekend of including some focus groups, including some seminars, including some work groups, and then coming out with an actionable report so they can take some next steps into becoming more millennial friendly. And then we've written some curriculum too that's on Download Youth Ministry right now. So it's either for youth or for young adults, millennials as well. And then we've also just got free resources that we love to give away from our website too. So cool. People can grab those if they want.
Awesome. So we'll talk about plugging where you are and everything later. Yeah. But that's awesome. So you've gotten so much experience, from the nonprofit world and from years in the church, but also now this new venture, working with other churches and everything, and helping them out. What's some bits of wisdom that you'd like to share? You've shared some already, from maybe trying to mix the students instead of trying to split them up. What are some other pieces of wisdom that you picked up through the years that you think other youth leaders could really benefit from?
Yeah. I think I approach youth ministry in a different way than a lot of people do. And part of that's just my background in the nonprofit world before I went into ministry. So a lot of us don't like the administrative stuff. Maybe this is cliche, but that was like my jam. That's the stuff that I love to do. And the better... the more effective strategy I had, the better I could relate to the kids. So as I created, or as we as a team created strategy and focus together, the more that would release me to build relationships with the teenagers that I was there to serve. So I would just say, don't neglect that stuff. Read up on strategy in the business world, in the nonprofit world, in the ministry world, so that you can know exactly where you're going, exactly where God's called your ministry to. And you might have an inkling of what that is, or God may be revealing some of that to you bit by bit. But when you lean into it and write it down and have that as the guide of everything that you do, it makes your ministry that much more powerful and impactful in kids' lives. So cool. Get a strategy going.
That's cool. That's great. I think a lot of times, stereotypes about youth ministers, we just go in because we like to play games and have fun. But I'm finding more and more youth leaders that are going in it because they're serious about really changing the lives of the next generation. And that's huge. If you have a strategy to go in, you're not just going, okay, we're just going to hang out and do whatever, sort of thing. But if you really analyze, okay, this is our situation and this is what we feel that God is really calling us to do to reach the next generation in this community, and then, develop a plan to go do it. I think that's going to help so much.
Yeah. And Mark DeVries from written a bunch of books, Sustainable Youth Ministry, family-based youth ministry. He says, I'm paraphrasing him here, but he basically says, there's a great word for somebody that's super energetic and spontaneous and a lot of fun to be around. There's a word for those people in youth ministry, and it's called volunteer. Our job, our sacred task, really, as youth workers and those who get called to work with teenagers, is building the structure and the strategy to make sure that we can make it fun, make it entertaining, but make it powerful for the kids. And right. We're not called into pizza parties; we're called into changing lives for Jesus. So,
that's great. Cool. Any other tips or anything?
I think that's it.
That's it. Right.
That one's just so awesome.
Yeah, it is.
No, I would say build a strategy and then build a team and
Yes.
train your team. We had some kids that were amazing but challenging. We had kids that were dealing with issues that we had no idea how to deal with, that I had no idea how to deal with, and so it wasn't also just about me knowing all things. I didn't know enough about cutting, so we brought in a psychologist and we're not a huge church. We weren't a huge church, but bringing in a psychologist to teach our volunteers and anyone else who wanted to learn about what is cutting, and then training them on any other issue that they feel they need to learn more about, and giving them a voice in what that training's all about. So, again, our role, our job is building up those people to lean into their calling of volunteering with kids too. It's not just about my calling to impact kids.
Right.
So train them enough that they can live into that calling fully.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I'm constantly learning more and more about. But, I felt called in youth ministry because I, like many people, love hanging out with kids and
totally
want to help them, understand more about Jesus. But the more and more God teaches me, he's like, hey, I want you to spend more time with me, yourself, and then pouring into the other leaders and the parents and make sure they're equipped as much as possible. And it's so much of a mind shift because that's not what I necessarily thought I was getting myself into. But the more I do it, the more I do really enjoy it as well. Yeah. So that's been really cool.
And that was such an advantage that I didn't know I had, was when I didn't go into ministry right out of Bible college and had a chance to grow up, which sounds negative and sounds bad, but I'm only speaking of myself personally. Looking back, I was not ready. I thought I was mature enough. But if you had given, 20-year-old me a bunch of kids from the community that were cutting, and all from broken homes and foster homes and kids whose parents had committed suicide, I would have burned out and been no use to anyone. And it was still really difficult, even 7 years later.
Sure.
But I'd grown up, become a dad, stuff like that, that just gave me a broader perspective where I could be so much more useful to these kids now that I'd had a bit more life experience. So if you graduate from Bible college and don't find a job right away in youth ministry, it's not the end of the world. Use it effectively. Use that time to season yourself and mature and grow. And then eventually you might get called back, just like I was.
Cool. That's great. No, that's really good especially because I talk to a lot of student ministers or want to be student ministers who are fresh out of college and kind of get upset because they can't find a job right away. But, it's not the end of the world. Like you said, it's, go get some more experience and mature, and, God's going to open the door at some point.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Where can people find you and your ministry and more about what you do and everything online?
Yeah, I guess the best place is to head to millennialministry.net.
Okay.
Millennialministry.net. A pop-up's going to show up like 10 seconds in. If you want to get some free stuff, we got an Engage Millennials worksheet that's really a step one in figuring out how your church is millennial friendly or not. So you can evaluate yourself based on some core values that we define there. And seeing where your strengths already are as a church and where some of your weaknesses are, and then figuring out where you can grow based on those strengths and hopefully pull up some of those weaknesses too. So there's that, and then just some other information about who we are at Millennial Ministry and what we do and how we love to help churches.
Cool. That'd be awesome. So definitely make sure you check that out. Thanks again for joining us. And anything else you'd like to share before we close out?
Canada's awesome.
Canada's awesome. Thanks for being our first international guest, actually. So we had someone on last month from an international church, but still in the United States. But you're our first international guest. So
right. I don't even think I said A, did I?
I did not hear it, actually. No.
Yeah, probably not.
There was a couple of boots here and there, but no A.
Hockey season's about to start.
There you go. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much, and may God bless your ministry.
All right. Thank you. You too.
once again, be sure to check out Geoff's stuff, especially this millennialministry.net. I really believe it's going to be an excellent resource in how we reach the next generation. If your church has been struggling, like a lot of churches do, with reaching this next generation, make sure you check out millennialministry.net and all these other places where you can check out stuff from Geoff Kullman online. Also, thanks so much to our sponsors, WorkCamp NE, National Network of Youth Ministries, and Reach Youth New England. Thank you so much for your sponsorship. Without you, a lot of this couldn't happen. And so we are so grateful for your sponsorship. You, listeners, if you are not checking out WorkCamp NE, if you're not checking out the National Network of Youth Ministries, if you're not checked out Reach Youth New England, be sure to head to their websites and check them out. All the information is going to be in our show notes on my website, but also on studentministry.podbean.com, the show website, and all your descriptions and everything on all the different podcatchers and everything. Speaking of that, if you have not subscribed yet, be sure to subscribe. That way, every month you will get the episode just downloaded to your device, your computer, your phone, whatever you listen to these podcasts through, and it'll just be taken right to your device automatically. We usually try to target the top of the month, but some things happen sometimes, but usually the top of the month we'll have another podcast for you, another interview with another youth worker, and if you subscribe, it's going to be delivered right to you. Also, be sure to share this with other people. Like, if you know another youth worker, youth minister that really could benefit from these conversations and the wisdom that is shared from these youth workers, be sure to share that with them. And finally, be sure to leave a comment. We love comments. In fact, the more comments that we get, especially the positive ones, but as more comments that we get on iTunes and stuff like that, the more this podcast can rise up to the top and be visible. And so a lot of this depends on you. If you like what you hear, be sure to leave a positive comment. That'd be awesome. And be sure to get in contact with me. If you have someone, you're like, man, this person needs to be on this podcast, contact me. You can contact me in one of two different ways. You can contact me on Twitter. My name is @SteveCullum on there, SteveCullum. You can contact me on Twitter. That's fine. Or you can also send us an email. We have an email address for the podcast. That's just studentministrypodcast@gmail.com. Studentministrypodcast@gmail.com. And you can send me a longer thing than you could send, in the so many characters in Twitter. But we want to just thank you so much for tuning in once again, and may God bless your ministry to students and families.